Everyone talks about California when they talk about the fault line America should be afraid of. The San Andreas gets the movies, the headlines, the earthquake drills in school textbooks. But ask the scientists who actually study this for a living which fault keeps them up at night. And most of them won't say California at all. They'll point 3 states north to a stretch of coastline most Americans have never thought twice about, and they'll tell you it's overdue for something almost no living person on this continent has ever experienced. It's called the Cascadia subduction zone, and it runs for roughly 700 miles off the Pacific coast, from Northern California up through Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia. Most people driving along that coastline have no idea it's sitting almost directly on top of one of the most dangerous geological features in North America. That's part of what makes it so unsettling to the people who study it. It's quiet. It doesn't rattle windows every few weeks the way California does. And that silence isn't a sign of safety. It's the opposite. To understand why Cascadia frightens seismologists more than the San Andreas, you have to understand what kind of fault it actually is. The San Andreas is what's called a strike-slip fault. 2 plates sliding sideways past each other, grinding and occasionally jerking as they catch. And release. It produces strong, damaging earthquakes, no question. But Cascadia is a different animal entirely. It's a subduction zone, meaning one massive tectonic plate, the Juan de Fuca plate, is being forced underneath another, the North American plate, at a slow, relentless crawl of a few centimeters a year. That's the same basic mechanism baked in the largest earthquakes ever recorded on Earth, including the 2004 Indian Ocean quake and the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan. Subduction zones are where you get magnitude 9 events. Strike-slip faults like the San Andreas essentially never produce anything that large. There's a hard physical ceiling on how big a strike-slip earthquake can get, and Cascadia doesn't have that ceiling. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The 2 plates at Cascadia aren't sliding past each other smoothly. They're locked, stuck together by friction, unable to move, while the plates around them keep pushing. That means stress has been building underneath the Pacific Northwest for centuries, with nowhere to go. Every year that passes without a rupture is another year of accumulated strain stored in the rock, waiting for the moment the lock finally breaks. And scientists know almost exactly how long it's been building, because Cascadia already did this once, and left behind an extraordinary paper trail. On the night of January 26, 1700, the Cascadia Fault let go in a single catastrophic rupture. Native oral histories along the coast describe violent shaking and land sinking into the sea. Entire forests of cedar trees were killed instantly when the coastline dropped and salt water flooded in around their roots, leaving behind what are now called ghost forests, stands of dead trees still standing along the coastline more than 3 centuries later. The quake sent a tsunami racing across the entire Pacific Ocean. 9 hours later, without any earthquake having been by, Ian felt it all. A wave with no warning struck the eastern coast of Japan, damaging homes and flooding fields. For nearly 300 years, no one understood where that wave had come from. Japanese records described it in detail, but with no earthquake to explain it. It became known as an orphan tsunami. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that American and Japanese researchers pieced the mystery together, cross-referencing tree ring data from the ghost forests with the timing of the Japanese flooding records, and confirmed that a massive earthquake, somewhere around magnitude 9, had torn open the Pacific Northwest coastline on that January night and sent a wave across an entire ocean before anyone in North America even had a written record of it happening. That's the scale scientists are talking about when they say Cascadia is the fault they fear most. Not a repeat of a typical California quake, a repeat of one of the largest earthquakes ever documented on the planet, striking a coastline now home to millions of people instead of the far smaller population that lived there in 1700. And based on geological evidence buried in coastal sediment layers, this isn't a one-time event. Researchers have found evidence of dozens of past Cascadia ruptures, stretching back thousands of years, striking on average every 200 to 500 years. Though the exact spacing varies considerably, the 1700 earthquake was 326 years ago as of this year. Depending on which historical interval you use for comparison, that puts the region somewhere inside the window where another rupture becomes geologically plausible, and current estimates put the odds of a magnitude 8.0 or larger Cascadia earthquake at roughly 1 in 3 over the next 50 years, with a smaller but still serious chance of a full-length magnitude 9 class rupture across the entire zone. None of that means an exact date can be predicted. No scientist on Earth can tell you the earthquake is coming next Tuesday or next year or in the next decade. What they can tell you, with real confidence, is that the fault is locked, that the stress is building, and that when it finally releases, the region is not currently built to withstand what's coming. To understand why the danger here is different from California, picture what actually happens when a subduction zone this size ruptures. unlike a typical California earthquake, which might produce 30 seconds or so of shaking near the epicenter. A full Cascadia rupture is expected to shake the ground continuously for 4 to 6 minutes, not 30 seconds. Minutes. Long enough for structures that survive the first wave of shaking to be worn down and eventually fail under sustained motion they were ever designed to absorb for that length of time. And because the fault runs offshore for hundreds of miles, the shaking wouldn't be confined to one city near an epicenter. It would hit the entire coastal length of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California more or less simultaneously, an area now home to an estimated 15 million people. Then comes the second wave of the disaster. When a section of ocean floor that size suddenly lurches upward, it doesn't just shake the ground, it displaces an enormous volume of seawater all at once, generating a tsunami that begins radiating outward within minutes. For coastal communities, the warning time before the first wave arrives could be as short as 10 to 20 minutes, in some cases even less. For people with mobility issues, for anyone cut off by roads that just collapsed in the earthquake itself, that window may simply not be enough. Federal emergency planners have estimated that a Cascadia EA, earthquake and tsunami together, could kill somewhere in the range of 10 to 13,000 people, injure tens of thousands more, and leave over 1 million people without homes, figures that officials involved in the planning process have called conservative rather than worst case. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has reportedly described this scenario in internal planning discussions as likely to be the worst natural disaster in the history of the United States, worse than any hurricane, any wildfire, any earthquake the country has faced before. That's not marketing language for a disaster movie. That's the framing used inside the actual emergency planning apparatus of the federal government, because the geography of this fault makes the potential scale genuinely unprecedented for American soil. Part of what makes Cascadia so much more dangerous in practice than it looks on a map is what happens to infrastructure once the shaking starts. Bridges and overpasses across the region, especially older ones built before the risk was fully understood, are expected to suffer significant damage, or collapse outright, cutting off road access to entire towns, right when those towns need help getting in and people getting out. Power, water, and cell service are expected to fail across most of the affected region within the first minutes of shaking. Landslides triggered by the shaking itself would block additional roads in the hillier parts of the region, some of them for weeks. And because the disaster covers such an enormous geographic area all at once, unlike a localized quake where neighboring cities can send help quickly, emergency responders and National Guard units would essentially be dealing with a disaster zone the length of an entire coastline, stretching their resources thin exactly when concentrated help is needed most. One detail that consistently surprises people who look into Cascadia for the first time is just how little the public conversation about American earthquake risk has focused on it compared to California. Part of that comes down to a simple, brutal fact about how history shapes memory. California has earthquakes constantly. People there have felt the ground move in their lifetime, sometimes many times. That direct lived experience keeps the risk visible and present in a way policy and public attention respond to. Cascadia, by contrast, hasn't ruptured in over 3 centuries. No one alive has felt what a full Cascadia earthquake feels like. There's no living memory to draw on, no viral footage from the last time, nothing anchoring the risk to something people have personally experienced. Psychologically, a threat with no living witnesses is far easier to underestimate, even when the geological evidence behind it is just as solid as anything measured on the San Andreas. That gap between the actual risk and the public's attention to it became national news for a period after a widely read 2015 magazine feature laid out the Cascadia scenario in stark detail, warning that the region was, in the words used at the time, overdue for something on a scale the modern Pacific Northwest had never had to face. The reporting spurred new emergency drills, renewed building code discussions, and a wave of public attention that briefly made Cascadia a household name. But scientists and urgency planners in the region will tell you that preparedness on the ground still lags far behind the scale of what the geology suggests is coming, especially when it comes to the exact kind of infrastructure most likely to fail first. Older bridges, unreinforced buildings constructed before modern seismic codes existed, and coastal towns with limited high ground nearby for tsunami evacuation. Recent scientific work has only added new layers of urgency to the picture rather than easing it. Researchers using ocean floor seismic networks have found that the northern portion of the Cascadia zone appears to be built in G-strain in a way that suggests it could rupture differently and potentially produce even larger earthquakes than the central portion of the fault that scientists have studied more thoroughly in the past. A comprehensive new mapping survey of the seafloor along the entire 700-mile length of the fault has revealed that Cascadia isn't one single uniform structure, but is instead broken into at least 4 distinct segments, information that will directly shape how scientists model which sections are most likely to fail first. and how large any given rupture might actually be. And in a finding that adds an entirely new dimension of concern, researchers Ave identified evidence that Cascadia and the San Andreas Fault to the south may be capable of triggering each other within minutes to hours during a major rupture, raising the disturbing possibility that the next big one might not be confined to a single fault system at all, but could unfold as a cascading multi-region disaster hitting the west coast almost simultaneously. There's also a slower-moving hazard tied to Cascadia that gets far less attention than the shaking and the tsunami, but which scientists say could reshape the region for generations afterward. When a subduction zone ruptures, the land above it doesn't just shake, it physically drops, sometimes by a meter or more, permanently lowering the elevation of huge stretches of coastline. Areas that are currently dry land, including parts of cities and towns built directly on those coastal flats, would become tidal wetland essentially overnight, combined with rising sea levels from sea. His effective found it could more than double the number of people, buildings, and roads exposed to regular flooding along the coast, a problem that wouldn't resolve itself after the initial disaster response wound down, but would instead persist for decades or even centuries afterward, permanently reshaping how and where people can safely live along that coastline. It's worth pausing on why none of this qualifies as fear-mongering or exaggeration. Every piece of this picture, the 1700 rupture, the ghost forests, the orphan tsunami in Japan, the recurrence intervals drawn from sediment cores, the modern probability estimates comes from peer-reviewed geological and seismological research conducted over decades, as by multiple independent teams, not speculation dressed up as science. The Cascadia subduction zone is arguably one of the most thoroughly studied and best documented earthquake hazards in the world, specifically because the potential consequences are so severe that federal, state, and academic researchers have poured enormous resources into understanding it as precisely as current science allows. What makes this fault genuinely different from California isn't just the size of the earthquake it could produce. It's the combination of factors stacking on top of each other, a magnitude far beyond what a strike-slip fault can generate. A tsunami with almost no warning time for coastal communities, a shaking duration measured in minutes rather than seconds, ons, an affected region spanning 3 states and roughly 15 million residents instead of a single metropolitan area, infrastructure, particularly older bridges and unreinforced buildings that in many places was never built with a subduction zone scale earthquake in mind, and a public psychology shaped by 3 centuries without a single living memory of what this fault is actually capable of. None of this means the region is defenseless, or that nothing has been done. In the years since Cascadia's risk became better understood, Oregon, Washington, and California have updated building codes for new construction, expanded tsunami evacuation routes and signage along the coast, and run large. But officials involved in that preparedness work are candid that the region still has a long way to go before its infrastructure and evacuation planning genuinely match the scale of what the geology says is possible. Retrofitting older bridges and buildings to withstand minutes of subduction zone shaking is enormously expensive and, in many places, still years or decades away from completion. Coastal towns with limited high ground still face the same brutal math they've always faced. A tsunami that could arrive in 10 to 20 minutes, and a population that, in many cases, can't reach safety in time without better infrastructure or faster public alerts than currently exist. So why does this fault frighten scientists more than California's? Because the San Andreas, for all its danger, is a known, bounded, physically limited threat. Cascadia is something closer to a geological time bomb with a fuse that's been burning quietly for 3 centuries, capable of an earthquake nearly 50 times more powerful than anything the San Andreas has ever produced in recorded history. Teeting a coastline that has grown enormously in population since the last time this fault let go, largely without anyone alive today having any direct memory of what that actually looks or feels like. The last time this fault ruptured, the only casualties were a scattering of coastal indigenous communities and an unexplained flood on the other side of an ocean that took scientists 300 years to properly connect back to its source. The next time it happens, it will hit 15 million people, 3 states, several major cities, a nuclear plant, an airport network, a highway system, and a coastline that has been rebuilt entirely since anyone last saw what this fault is capable of doing. It's worth being fair to California here too, because none of this means the San Andreas is somehow safe. It absolutely isn't. A major San Andreas rupture would still be a devastating event for tens of millions of people in a state that has, unlike Cascadia, built much of its modern infrastructure specifically around the assumption that a big quake is always close at hand. That's precisely the point seismologists keep making. California has built an entire culture of earthquake readiness around a fault everyone can see and feel. Larly. Cascadia has had to build that same readiness almost entirely from geological inference, tree rings, sediment cores, and a foreign country's 400-year-old flood records, because the fault itself has stayed silent the entire time anyone has been paying attention. It's also worth being clear that Cascadia isn't the only fault system outside California that keeps American seismologists up at night. Deep in the middle of the country, far from any coastline, sits the New Madrid Seismic Zone, spanning parts of Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois. In the winter of 1811 and 1812, that fault system produced a sequence of earthquakes so powerful that witnesses reported the Mississippi River briefly appeared to run backward, church bells rang as far away as Boston, and the ground rose and fell in visible waves across the frontier towns nearby. Because the central United States sits on older, colder, and more rigid rock than the fractured crust of California, seismic energy there travels farther and shakes a far larger area than an equivalent quake would out west. A repeat of the New Madrid sequence today would threaten cities as far apart as Memphis, St. Louis, and Little Rock, in a part of the country where building codes have historically paid far less attention to earthquake risk than California or the Pacific Northwest, simply because the threat there is so much less visible day to day. Scientists remain divided on exactly how large the ongoing risk from New Madrid is today, but it's frequently mentioned in the same breath as Cascadia, specifically, because both faults share the same core problem: enormous potential consequences, paired with a public and a building code system that hasn't fully caught up to the danger, because neither fault behaves the way people expect a dangerous fault to behave. Still, when researchers compare the two, Cascadia tends to come out ahead in terms of sheer feared potential, mostly because of the tsunami component New Madrid simply doesn't have. An inland earthquake, however severe, doesn't send a wall of water into coastal cities within minutes. Cascadia does both at once: a massive shaking event and an unstoppable ocean-based disaster, arriving back-to-back with almost no time to react between them. Zoom in on the specific cities in Cascadia's path, and the stakes become even clearer. Seattle sits on its own set of shallower, more local fault lines, in addition to being close enough to Cascadia to experience severe shaking from an offshore rupture, meaning the city faces a layered earthquake risk most Americans don't fully appreciate. Older brick buildings across the city's historic districts, along with sections of aging infrastructure built long before modern seismic codes existed, remain some of the most vulnerable structures in the region. Portland sits along the Willamette River in a river valley that amplifies shaking in certain soil conditions, a phenomenon known as soil liquefaction, where saturated ground essentially behaves like a liquid during intense shaking, causing buildings and roads built on top of it to sink, tilt, or collapse, even when the shaking itself wasn't the strongest ever recorded. And the small coastal towns scattered along the actual shoreline of Oregon and Washington, places like Westport, Ocean Shores, and dozens of similarly sized communities, face the most immediate and least forgiving version of the disaster: a tsunami that could arrive before many residents even finish evacuating, in towns where the nearest high ground might be a mile or more away. None of this is designed to be paralyzing. Emergency planners in the region consistently make the same point: the earthquake itself cannot be stopped. But nearly everything about how survivable it is comes down to decisions made before it happens. Retrofitting a vulnerable building, identifying a tsunami evacuation route in advance, keeping emergency supplies on hand, knowing which structures in a community are least likely to withstand minutes of continuous shaking, all of those decisions measurably shift how many people walk away from this event once it finally happens. The same basic principle that kept Japan's death toll from a shallow, high-intensity earthquake far lower than it could have been applies just as directly here. Preparation doesn't prevent the fault from rupturing. It determines the outcome once it does. There's an honest answer, too, to the question everyone eventually asks. What does that actually mean for someone living in Seattle, Portland, or along the Oregon coast right now? It doesn't mean living in a state of constant dread over an event that could still be decades away. Scientists are careful to point out that a probability of roughly 1 in 3 over 50 years is not the same as a certainty next year, or even next decade. What it does mean, according to the people who study this fault for a living, is that the ordinary, unglamorous groundwork of preparedness matters more here than almost anywhere else in the country. Specifically, because so few people currently treat it as urgent. Knowing whether your home or workplace sits in a tsunami inundation zone, keeping a basic emergency kit with water and supplies for at least 2 weeks, rather than the standard 3 days recommended elsewhere, and understanding your community's evacuation routes before you ever need them are the same practical steps regional emergency agencies have been quietly urging residents to take for years, largely without the level of public attention California's earthquake risk receives as a matter of course. The deeper reason Cascadia unsettles scientists more than any fault in California ultimately isn't about the number attached to its potential magnitude, even though that number alone would be enough to justify serious concern. It's about the mismatch between what the geology says is coming and how little of everyday life along that coastline currently reflects it. California, for all its very real danger, has spent a century building a culture, a set of building codes, and a public psychology that assumes an earthquake could strike at any time. The Pacific Northwest is still in the early stages of building that same culture around a threat it can't see, feel, or remember, resting quietly offshore, already 3 centuries into a wait that, sooner or later, is going to end. That is why, when seismologists are asked privately which American fault actually keeps them up at night, so many of them stop talking about California and start talking instead about a quiet 700-mile stretch of coastline that hasn't made a sound in over 300 years and is running out of time before it does again.